Our first lab was based on constant velocity. The next logical lab to do would be one that was based on acceleration, an object speeding up. So that's what we're going to do today. You are going to write the following problem in the form of a question. I'm just going to simply tell you what you're doing. You're going to phrase it in the form of a question. We are essentially trying to find the acceleration of a cart on a decline. So on a hill, right? As I let the cart go down a hill, what is that cart's acceleration? That's what you're doing. It's simple. Rephrase what I just said into the form of a question. You're going to need to write that in your lab, the problem. You're also going to need to write the apparatus/materials today, unlike last time. I've got a picture of the apparatus/materials up there. My suggestion for you is to also take a picture of your apparatus, not because it's required in your lab write-up. In fact, it doesn't replace a list of apparatus, but what it does do is a couple of things. Number one, it reminds you. So it's hard to forget something if you've got a picture in front of you to remind you of all the materials you used. Secondly, if you insert that into your document and you label that, it's a nice way of illustrating those materials. It's not required to do that. You can just list them. But again, if you've listed them, or if you've labeled them on a picture, that's an even better way to illustrate what your materials are. So what do we got here? Well, many of the materials are exactly the same as what we had last time. We have a motion sensor. Can't see that very well, so I'll switch colors here. We also have our AirLink apparatus, which is the device that's connected by a cord to the motion sensor. This is what actually interprets the data, and then it sends it to your iPhone. We're going to call this our AirLink, and of course that beams it wirelessly to your iPhone or to your Android device or whatever it is that you have. We also have a dynamics cart, but this time the cart is not a motorized cart. This time this is one that's going to sit on a track and it's going to be allowed to go down that track that's on a decline. And of course, the one material that's dramatically different than what we had last time is that track. Last time you didn't use a track at all. This time you are going to use this dynamics track. And there's a couple of different tracks depending upon what kind of cart you have. Finally, underneath one end of the track, you're going to have books, calculators, whatever. I'm going to put books in quotation marks because that's what lots of people tend to use. But in my picture, you can actually see that I've used DVDs. It doesn't matter what you use, just make sure you specify what you used. All right? That's our apparatus/materials. What's the procedure going to look like? Well, it's almost the same as last time, the constant velocity lab, except that you're not going to flip on the switch of the cart, put it down in front of the motion sensor. This time you're going to set up the decline with your books and whatever. By the way, you don't want too high of a hill. So if you got, here's a set of stairs. You do not want your ramp to be like this off of a set of stairs. Okay, you want a decline to be off of a couple of books. Once you've got that set up, your motion sensor set up, your AirLink set up, and so on, then you're going to put your cart. Literally just put your cart on the track, press start, and let it roll down. You guys can come up with the steps for your procedure yourself. Just make sure, please, that you do number those steps. Don't write the steps in a paragraph form. Number them. Step 1, did this. Step 2, we did this. Step 3, we did that. No, that's okay. That's a good question, though. Do we need to explain how we set up the AirLink? First, we turned on the Bluetooth. No, you don't need to do that at all. What we need to do is write a procedure that would allow somebody that knew how to use the equipment to perform the same activity. That make sense? So we have to assume that people know how to use the equipment. You just need to tell them what to do with that equipment. It's kind of like this, and this seems silly, but I'll give you this analogy to kind of illustrate what we need to include and what we don't need to include. Let's say that Sebastian is collecting data here, and he breaks the lead of his pencil. So then he goes over and sharpens his pencil, and then he goes to write up his lab and says, after breaking lead of pencil, went to sharpen pencil. I mean, you know, we clearly we don't need to include that in a procedure, right? Why don't we need to include that? Because we assume that everybody that's going to do this lab knows how to use a pencil and sharpen a pencil, right? They know how to use those kind of materials, the instruments, right? And we're going to assume the same thing here. Everybody knows how to use the AirLink. Everybody knows how to use their iPhone. We just need to tell them what to do with it. Yep. Good question, though. Yep. Just rolls down. It's not motorized. Nope, not at all. Not at all. Good? You guys are going to write out those steps. Somebody in the last class said, how many steps do we need? There's no rule on that. Okay? There's no rule at all on that. You need to include what you did. If that happens to be 3 steps, if that happens to be 12 steps, it is what it is. Okay? Yours might be 5 steps. Somebody else's might be 8 steps because you phrased it differently. That's fine, as long as all of you include what you need to include with it. Once you've done your procedure, you're going to have a bunch of data. It's actually going to include 10 or 12 columns of data, as you remember from the last time you did an experiment. We're going to delete all the columns except for 3. Last time we deleted them all except for 2. Last time it was time and position. This time it's time, position, and velocity. So all these ones over here to the right of that, just delete them. This is going to be imported into the spreadsheet that's already been created for you within Google Classroom. Once you have that data, what do you think you're going to do with it? What are you always going to do with the data table? Graph it, except this time, because we have time and position and time and velocity, we're going to end up plotting 2 graphs. The first graph, you can imagine, is going to be position versus time. And the second graph, as you can imagine, is going to be velocity versus time. There's 2 analysis questions that you're going to have to complete here. The first one relates to the first graph, and the second one relates to the second graph. Describe the motion of the object using the position time graph, referencing the shape of the graph. Well, listen, we know it's acceleration, right? What's important here is the reference to the shape of the graph. So you're going to say it's acceleration. We know this because the position time graph was a straight line. Or it's acceleration because the position time graph was a graph or a line that was curving upwards, or it was a graph that was curving downwards, or whatever the case, or it was random points, or whatever it is that tells you from the graph that it's acceleration is how you answer question number 1. And then finally, question number 2 says determine the acceleration of the object using the velocity time graph. Google Sheets is going to spit out the equation for you. You're going to display the equation on the graph, and then you're just simply going to write down in that question, answering that question, the slope that Google Sheets spat out for you. Does that make sense? Your conclusion? Well, you guys will remember from Science 10 that your conclusion will normally relate back to a hypothesis, right? We don't have a hypothesis, but a hypothesis relates to a problem. So our conclusion is not going to relate to our hypothesis that doesn't exist. Our conclusion is going to relate back to our problem. So basically, you're going to have 2 sentences again, which are sentence number 1, what's the velocity of the toy car? The velocity of the toy car is blank. And then, what's the second sentence? How do we know? We know the velocity of the toy car is blank because, sorry, the acceleration, yes, sorry, thank you. The acceleration, that was your problem, right, to find the acceleration. The acceleration of the toy car is blank. We know that's because of blank. And then, of course, your sources of error. Be careful with sources of error, right? Like, don't say, like, let's say you gave me a source of error last time. It was a simple fix, but you just didn't think of it until after the fact. Don't do the same thing this time. Don't make the same mistake this time. Okay? If you caught that source of error, if it was after the fact, that's okay. Well, it's before the fact this time. So fix it. Right? Don't leave things to create sources of error. Learn from your sources of error. Yep. I like to see 3 pretty good sources of error, but there's no hard rule on that. Like I've marked it correct before when I see 2 really, really good ones. Like if they're like, yeah, I love that one, then I cut you a little bit of slack on the number sometimes. But similarly, if I see 5 and they're all brutal, But you don't get marks for that either. So it's not a number thing, but general rule of thumb would be about 3. Okay, for if they're decent. What do you got to hand in for this one? Well, we've pretty much gone through that already, but we'll just quickly summarize it. We have our problem. We have our materials, or our apparatus, whatever you want to call it. We have our procedure, and remember to number those procedure steps. We have our data. We have our analysis. We have our conclusion. And we have our sources of error. Remember to include your data table and your analysis, which are your graphs, in the document. You're going to plot those graphs within Google Sheets, right? I don't want you to leave them there. I want you to copy and paste them into your document. Same thing with your data table. Copy and paste it into the document. I will not click on your spreadsheet to check for your data. If you don't have it in your document, I will not click on the spreadsheet. So it's going to be a 0 for data. Okay, last time I clicked on the spreadsheet and I gave you some marks because you forgot to move it over. This time you got to move it over. All right?